What does the Secretary of State think, in the light of that, we should be doing? Because clearly they're having success.
Mr. Speaker, we all know that the impact of this terrible virus has been very different across the world. The honourable gentleman has talked about countries in the Far East. The impact if you look at in South America or India or in Europe, it's very different. And I don't think you can simply draw a conclusion that the reason for that differences is the policy on masks. The reason why, the primary reason we were able to announce what we did yesterday in terms of the step 4 measures is the vaccine. And if the honourable gentleman looks at the countries he mentioned, particularly Japan, he'll see that their vaccination rates are a lot lower than the rates that we have, and that will partly explain why they may be taking a different approach and how they're tackling the vaccine, the pandemic at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his new role, and I warmly welcome his statements about the importance of addressing non-COVID health issues. Sadly, for the last 17 months, our children have been not seen and not heard, and I know from my own children and those of my constituents the devastating impact that lockdowns have had on the well-being of our children and young people. So can my right honourable friend set out what measures he is taking as we return to normal to focus on the physical and mental health of our young people and make sure that the anxiety and the physical inactivity of the pandemic is not leaving permanent scars?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this, Mr. Speaker, and sadly, because of the necessary measures that we've had to take, the impact on children has been immense in the negative ways that she's just set out. And she will know, just from my own research that I did before coming back into government, we've seen, for example, a huge rise in reports of child abuse. And the reporting, for example, to the NSPCC's Childline has rocketed during the course of the pandemic, and that is a direct cause of children not being in school, not having enough people to report that kind of activity to, and so we need to absolutely respond to that. And in terms of the measures, what I hope and what I know, and the Education Secretary will have more to say about this in a moment, the measures that we've already announced between yesterday and the measures today, I think will make a dramatic difference to children's well-being.
Let's go to Charlotte Littles. Charlotte.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The pandemic is not over, and learning to live with the virus means putting in place measures to reduce risk. Flamefast, based in Woolston Grange in Warrington North, manufactures CO2 monitors, which alongside measures such as air filtration and improved ventilation, can help to dramatically reduce the risk of indoor transmission of the virus. So why has the Secretary of State ignored calls from the Labour Party to put in place measures such as air filtration, improved ventilation and CO2 monitoring to reduce the risk in indoor confined spaces, particularly in hospitals and care homes for the most vulnerable in our communities, which could help to save lives and to give a vital boost to our manufacturing sectors?
Mr. Speaker, I think it's not right for the Honourable Lady to suggest that the government has ignored the need to combat this virus with better air filtration, with better ventilation. A lot of the funding the government has provided during the course of this pandemic, so for example, extra funding to care home providers, has been there precisely to introduce and help fund some of these measures.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome my right honourable friend to his new place. I know that he will share the view of many of my constituents in West Berkshire that we must do all we can to avoid another national lockdown. In the event that the vaccine efficacy should falter as we head into the winter months, say because of a new variant, could he set out what extra steps his department is taking to ensure that this winter won't be a repeat of last?
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell my honourable friend is that one of the measures, just one that we are taking, is that we do have, so we have a huge number of tests that take place, over 500,000 a day, and that does give us a certain insight into how this virus is changing, if it is. And the genome sequencing resources that we have are the best in the world. We do almost half of the genome sequencing in the world, and that is fed directly to our scientists and our world-leading vaccine program and taken into account as we develop new vaccines. And the Honourable Lady knows about the booster program. I think the booster program will continue into next year, and who knows how long, but every time we have a booster, we will be doing everything we can to take into account changes in the virus itself.
Let's go to Sir Tony Lloyd. Tony.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Health Secretary has already referred to the pressures on our GPs and our hospitals from non-COVID patients, and that, of course, is real. Most health professionals, doctors, nurses and others, have been double jabbed and regularly use at least the lateral flow test to ensure that they're not infected with COVID. But one of the local hospitals that affects my constituency, Fairfield, tells me that there are something like 30% of doctors who were not available recently because they'd been pinged, they'd come into contact, not surprisingly, with somebody with COVID. Not because they found they were infected, but because they then had to go and quarantine for that 10-day period. We do risk, Mr. Speaker, a build-up of cases which will increase the number of times our medical professionals are likely to find themselves pinged. Could the Secretary have a look at this and see if there's some way, at least the medical staff, are bringing forward that August date?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman has raised this issue of understanding people that are pinged, so to speak, that by having come into contact with an infected person, they do have to self-isolate. The announcement that I've made today will clearly make a huge difference to everyone that is pinged in such a way, including all those fantastic people that work in our health service, the doctors, the nurses and others. And as I've said, it will come into force from August the 16th. We did think carefully about whether we could do it earlier than that, and it's a fair question, but the reason we decided not to was based on the best public health advice was that by August the 16th there'll be many more people, even more than now, that are double jabbed, and that extra layer of protection makes us more comfortable to stick to this August the 16th date.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the Secretary of State's statement. Primary care has shouldered the brunt of the vaccine deployment, and many GP surgeries in Stoke-on-Trent South are not yet back at full capacity with general appointments. A number of my constituents have raised the difficulties of getting to see their GP, so will my right honourable friend do all he can to ensure primary care services are able to fully recover?
Well said.
Yes, absolutely, Mr. Speaker. I can give my honourable friend that assurance, as well as the extra resources we're putting in. Even if you think about the measures that I've announced today about self-isolation and no need to self-isolate if you have if you've been in contact with an infected person but been double vaccinated, that will help across the board, and certainly that includes our NHS and our primary care providers.
I now suspend in the House for 3 minutes to enable necessary arrangements to be made for the next business. Order.
Order! I call Secretary of State Gavin Williamson to make a statement.
With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to make a statement regarding restrictions that will be lifted for schools, early years, childcare, colleges and universities when we move to step 4, which is currently anticipated as the 19th of July. The Prime Minister announces that step 4 will be able to remove swathes of restrictions on daily life, and that after 16 months of sacrifice by those across society, we will return ever closer to normality. We have faced down together a historic public health emergency, and that we all owe a great debt of gratitude to pupils, parents and teachers who have given up so much as we have taken action to save lives. I do, however, want to highlight to everyone that step 4 does not mean the end of a pandemic, and some restrictions will be kept in place while we move towards more of a population being fully vaccinated. While the pandemic is not over, we are moving into a new phase of managing COVID from strict rules and towards ever more greater personal responsibility. When I came to this place last week, I again set out my priority to put the interests of children first. We know from our own experience and evidence that children are better off in classrooms with their friends and teachers. Millions of children and young people have been back in the classroom since March the 8th, learning with their friends and teachers. This is hugely valuable for their well-being as well as for their education. I also made clear that I do not think that it is acceptable that children should face greater restrictions over and above those of wider society, especially since they have given up so much to keep older generations safe during this pandemic. So, having balanced the risks, I'm pleased to tell members across the House that key restrictions on education and childcare will come to an end as we move to step 4. Though keeping children in consistent groups was essential to control the spread of the virus when our population was less vaccinated, we recognise that the system of bubbles and isolation is causing disruption to many children's education. That is why we'll be ending bubbles and transferring contact tracing to the NHS test and trace system for early years settings, schools and colleges. Where there are outbreaks, schools and colleges may be contacted by NHS test and trace, and they will also work with local health teams as they currently do now. We're also setting out new rules that mean that from the 16th of August, children will only need to isolate if they have tested positive for COVID-19. I'm also pleased to be able to say there will be no restrictions on in-person teaching and learning in universities unless students are advised to isolate or impacted by local outbreaks. From step 4, a more proportionate set of controls will apply in early years, schools, colleges and higher education institutions. These will maintain a baseline of protective measures in education settings while maximising attendance and minimising disruption to children and young people's education. In addition to ending bubbles, it will not be necessary to stagger start and finish times. Schools and colleges may, of course, continue with these measures until the end of the summer term, if they so wish. My right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, outlined earlier today that we can ease restrictions on the rules of self-isolation for close contacts of someone who has tested positive for COVID-19. In education settings, all other existing measures, including guidance on isolation of contacts, will stay in place until the end of this term, in line with isolation rules for the rest of the population as more adults are vaccinated. Settings will continue to have a role in working with health protection teams in the case of a local outbreak. Where necessary, some measures may need to be reintroduced. From August the 16th, those under the age of 18 years old will no longer be required to self-isolate if they are contacted by NHS Test and Trace as a close contact of a positive COVID-19 case. This will balance the need to keep children safe at the same time as allowing them to get the education that they deserve and need. Instead, children will be contacted by Test and Trace, informed they have been in close contact with a positive case, and advised to take a PCR test. 18-year-olds will be treated in the same way as children until 4 months after their 18th birthday to allow them to have the opportunity to get fully vaccinated. Having listened to teachers and balancing the risks to health and education, to maximise attendance and minimise disruption to children and young people's education, some protective measures, including enhanced hygiene and ventilation, will remain in place for the autumn term. From step 4, face coverings will no longer be advised for pupils, students, staff and visitors, either in classrooms or in communal areas, and social distancing will no longer be necessary. As I mentioned earlier, testing programmes remain important as we move cautiously out of restrictions. With this in mind, secondary schools and colleges will be asked to provide 2 on-site tests to their students at the start of term, with regular home testing continuing until the end of September, when this will be reviewed. It is vital that secondary school and college students continue to test for the last few weeks of this term and throughout September. Education settings were still operating over the summer will continue to test twice a week, with asymptomatic test kits still available to families over the summer break as well. I also want to encourage all teachers, educational staff and eligible students to get their vaccines. It is incredibly important for all staff to get the second dose of a vaccine as soon as they are eligible, so they secure the strongest possible protection against COVID-19. In line with wider changes to isolation from August the 16th, if in close contact with someone who has tested positive, fully vaccinated teachers will be able to remain in the classroom from the autumn term. My department has just set out more detail and published new guidance for arrangements in education settings from step 4, covering both a summer period and the following term when children will return to school. I want to take this opportunity to assure members that head teachers in their constituencies can contact the Department of Education if they have any questions about the new guidance that we have published. Madam Deputy Speaker, no government would want to restrict people's freedom in the way we have had to since the spread of COVID-19. We have prioritised education since the start of this pandemic. We made sure that schools and colleges were the last to close, but the first to open. We kept school and college places open to vulnerable children and those of key workers throughout the pandemic, and procured millions of laptops and tablets for children to learn at home. None of this could have been achieved without the incredible work of our inspirational teachers and wider educational staff. And I'd like to thank the parents and students who have shown patience and flexibility over the last 18 months. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that many colleagues will agree that today, as a nation, we prize the role of schools, colleges and universities more than ever before. With the ending of these restrictions, children and young people will be able to get back on with their education and lives while we continue to manage this pandemic. I commend the statement to the House.
Thank you. We now go to the Shadow Secretary of State, Kate Green.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and for advance sight of it. I'd also like to echo his tribute to the education staff, pupils and parents who've done so much over the past 15 months to keep children and young people learning. Just over an hour ago, the Department for Education confirmed that last week 623,000 pupils were not in school because of coronavirus. And while 471,000 of those pupils were out of class because of a bubble collapsing, there were still over 150,000 who were not in the classroom with confirmed or suspected cases of coronavirus or because of potential contact with a case outside the classroom. It's not just bubbles that have driven pupils from the classroom, it's the Conservatives' negligence in letting the Delta variant take hold at the same time as they failed to support schools with the necessary precautions. I've always said that school is the best place for children, for their learning, their well-being and their development, and that's why we must do everything we can to keep them there safely. Many parents will be relieved to hear that the chaotic bubbles policy is coming to an end, but the Secretary of State hasn't given us confidence that his alternative will keep more children in school without driving up infections. His department has piloted using testing instead of the bubble system, but he didn't mention this in his statement. Can he tell us the results of those pilots and using daily testing in some schools? Did it mean more hours in the classroom? Did it mean more cases? Did it mean an unmanageable workload for school leaders? Can he confirm how many schools pulled out of the pilots? And if the reasons for schools' withdrawal is informing his department's planning for next year? He said bubbles will end when we reach stage 4. But that there won't be any on-site testing until September. So what support is he putting in place to keep pupils in the classroom for the remainder of this term? He said bubbles need to end in order to support summer schools. Can he confirm that they will have mitigations in place in addition to testing so that children can learn and not just isolate over the summer? And separate to summer schools, his department has promised a holiday activities and food programme. Can you tell me what measures will be in place to ensure this programme can run so that children don't miss out on the opportunities it offers? The Secretary of State spoke of a baseline of protective measures when schools return in September. Can he say more about what they are? He mentioned better ventilation. Will all schools receive support from his department to put this in place? And specifically on masks, can he explain to me why masks were required in schools in March and April, but aren't required now when case numbers are much higher? Will he publish the scientific evidence that I'm sure he's received to underpin his decision? And if he can't do that, will he reconsider it? We know that the vaccination programme delivered by the NHS remains our route out of the pandemic, but we still don't know if it will be available to children. When does he expect to receive this advice? And when will he make it public? If the JCVI do propose vaccinating older children, can he guarantee that the infrastructure will be in place to begin that process before the return to the classroom in September? And as we look ahead to the new academic year, can he guarantee that schools, staff and pupils will know his plans for assessments next year by the 1st of September at the latest? The Secretary of State mentioned on-site testing in colleges, but what other measures will be in place? Have they been supported, for example, to implement better ventilation? I'm sure students will welcome the return of in-person teaching and learning in higher education, but can the Secretary of State say what protective measures will be in place in these settings and what steps will be taken to support the return and safe learning of international students? Madam Deputy Speaker, I want nothing more than for children to be in class, learning and spending time with their friends and their teachers. And it's right for their learning that we move away from the chaotic bubbles system. But we can't simply wish away the real challenges of the pandemic. Today's statement offers no clarity on how the government will stop infections spiralling, the Conservatives' inadequate testing regime, lack of action on ventilation, and their recklessness at the border have put our children's education at risk. This must not continue.
Secretary of State.
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Honourable Lady touched on a number of areas there. In terms of universities, we of course are always supporting universities in terms of international students, but also supporting them to get back to face-to-face teaching, welcoming youngsters back into the lecture theatre, which is, I know, something and part of the university experience that so many students have dearly, dearly missed. The Honourable Lady does seem to have missed probably actually the biggest point and the biggest thing that has actually changed over the past few months. And I do appreciate that the Honourable Lady is probably wedded, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the European Union vaccine programme, and she probably feels a sense of disappointment that actually this country decided to go out on its own and actually procure our vaccines. But the biggest difference is that actually in this country we've seen over 80 million vaccines already delivered into people's arms, giving them more protection, and so much more protection today, Madam Deputy Speaker, than we actually had back in March and April of this year, as this incredibly successful programme that has been led by the Prime Minister has had a real impact in terms of saving lives, keeping hospitalisation down, and ensuring that we can take these important steps back to normality, and both adults and, most importantly, children can get back on with their lives.
Robert Halford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I strongly welcome this government announcement today, and I thank my right honourable friend. We need to keep our children in school, not out of them. We know that in secondary schools, COVID-related absence was 10.4%, up from 6.2% on the 24th of June. And other analysis suggests that on an average year, 10 pupils due to sit GCSEs next summer have missed 1 in 4 days of face-to-face teaching this year. So what assessment has the government made of the impact on children not at school in exam years, and what remedial action are they going to take to ensure that there's a level playing field for these children who've missed so much school, they have a level playing field for next year's exams?
I know my right honourable friend raises a very important issue, and something that is, of course, concern to teachers, parents, but most of all pupils who will be looking towards 2022 and assessment and awarding of grades. It is our intention to move back to an exam system, but we do recognise that we need to ensure that there are mitigations that are put in place for pupils who will be taking that assessment in the next academic year. We will be looking at sharing more information as to what those mitigations are before the summer, and we'll obviously update his committee and the House accordingly.
We now go by video link to Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And many young people are extremely worried about next year's exams. And one young constituency recently told me, "I have never felt less confident in my ability to take part in next year's exams, if there even is that opportunity. And I'm sure many others are struggling. I ask for 2022 GCSE exams to be simpler, easier, and adapted to our lack of necessary education out of compassion." What does the Minister say to them, and when will schools get certainty about changes to next year's exams and assessments?
I think the Honourable Lady may not have heard the answer to my right honourable friend, the member for Harlow's question, but what we did say to my right honourable friend is that we'll be looking at giving further guidance and information to schools imminently, and we are very much looking at what are the measures to put mitigations there, but recognising the best form of assessment is always examination.
Sir Edward Lee.
Thank you for putting children first. In the last year, the education of children has been trashed. Now, whilst every death of a child is tragic, we have to understand there are 12.7 million children in this country, and sadly, every year 6,000 die. So can we have a sense of proportion? Will the Secretary of State reassure parents that the chances of any child falling seriously ill from COVID are, quote, vanishingly small, and there is no risk to children by what he's announced today.
My right honourable friend is right to point out how, as Professor Chris Whitty has pointed out so many times, that children have very little adverse effects of COVID on them if they're unfortunate enough to get it. And this is why we think that the steps that we have outlined today, combined with a vaccination programme that we are rolling out right across the country, means that it is right to take this next cautious but important step forward in light of the scientific, medical and health evidence.
Munira Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today's announcement about the scrapping of bubbles and self-isolation for pupils will be welcome news to many parents, pupils and teachers across the country. But he made very passing reference to the importance of ventilation. And we know now how we know about the importance of ventilation because it's an airborne virus. Therefore, what more is he doing to support schools to put better ventilation in place? I visited Richmond upon Thames School in my constituency yesterday. They've spent £15,000 alone on improving ventilation. Many schools simply can't do that. They're struggling to balance the books already. So what more support will he put in place and follow the example of Germany and New York City?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, at every stage during this pandemic, we've provided support for schools as part of their measures that they've needed to put in place in order to be able to restrict the transmission of COVID and ensure that they're able to be open. We recognise that good hand sanitisation and good hygiene along with ventilation are important. We continue to offer advice to schools as to how best to deliver that.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Digital inclusion is a huge issue for pupils across Rother Valley. However, both the government and local businesses such as AES Seal have stepped in to eliminate this barrier. AES Seal has provided computers for over 1,500 households across Rotherham, and this government has provided 1.3 million laptops and tablets to disadvantaged students during the pandemic across the country. Can my right honourable friend confirm that pupils will continue to benefit from this record investment in IT equipment?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend not only highlights the amazing work that we've seen in terms of distribution of laptops by the government right across the country, but the wonderful work of local businesses such as AES Seal, who have gone out of their way to support their communities, help children and make a real difference. And that really does show about how communities have come together to be able to support not just the elderly but also our children. It's a great testament, and I very much hope that the investment that AES Seal but also the government has made in terms of laptops and education technology will have a long and lasting legacy in terms of bettering people's education, not only in my honourable friend's constituency but in every one of our constituencies.
Christian Matheson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I press the Secretary of State on the question of exams that other honourable and right honourable members have mentioned? My constituent Ian is a teacher who points out that every time there have been changes to the exam system in the last couple of years to cope with the pandemic, it's been at last minute with very little time for schools and pupils to prepare. If the Secretary of State is considering changes to the exam system, can he have an open consultation with school leaders and teachers and get the plans in place as early as possible so that there isn't this sense of teachers being dumped upon at the last minute?
Well, I can absolutely assure the honourable gentleman that we talk to schools, teachers, school leaders, teachers and so many within the education sector continuously on these issues, and I can reassure him that, as has been mentioned to a couple of those who've raised questions, is that we're going to eminently be sharing further information in terms of assessment in the next academic year.
Damien Hines.
Speaker, can I strongly welcome my right honourable friend's statement and this return to normality, to stability with the contingencies and safeguards that he has set out. And I wonder would he agree with me that although sometimes people talk about a balance between education objectives and health objectives, actually overwhelmingly they go together, because being in school is so important for children's mental health, as we know, but also their physical health, and indeed for some children is a safety protective factor as well.
My right honourable friend is exactly right, and the benefits to mental health, the greatest single act that we can do in supporting children in their mental health was welcoming them back into schools on the 8th of March. That was the single act that anyone could have done to help every single child. And I notice that members opposite shake their head. I mean, they probably would like the situation where maybe schools remained empty and children just remained at home. And on this side, we recognise that the beneficial effects, not just in terms of the education, but also in terms of children's welfare, are delivered by children being in school.
We now go by video link to Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know that the Secretary of State is familiar with Hull, and he knows about the educational challenges that we faced in the city before COVID. So I just want to press the Secretary of State on whether he really believes that less than 1 hour of tutoring a fortnight over the next school year is really enough to make up for the 115 days of in-school teaching children in Hull have missed this year.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, she's right to say that I do know Hull very well, having my family coming from Hull, and you know, and I do recognise that there's been a great amount of challenge that schools, not just within the great city of Kingston upon Hull face, but right across the country. And that is why our support for schools is not just about tutoring, though as the Honourable Lady will be aware, there's actually small group tutoring. There's so much evidence to point out that it delivers some of the best educational catch-up and the best results in terms of the money invested out of any intervention. But actually there's the you know, recovery and COVID support in terms of premium that's gone to schools, so they're able to build on further actions and further interventions that they themselves can take to support children in order to be able to catch up on the work that they've missed.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I also welcome and thank my right honourable friend for his statement today, and thank everyone who's worked so hard, the families and the staff, to ensure that education's been delivered to children over the course of the pandemic. But can I ask him to clarify a point around the self-isolation requirements? I think, as every parent knows, children, particularly very young children, have coughs and colds to a penny and temperatures. And at the moment, a temperature leads to a self-isolation, family self-isolation requirement, causing huge disruption for the child's education and development and impact on families. Can he unpack a bit what the requirements will be around children developing coughs and colds, particularly in early years, and what guidance and protocols will be taken forward, whether isolation will be necessary, whether testing will be necessary, or whether it can be moved over and put as just a simple cough or cold?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, what we'd always encourage people to do if they are poorly or ill in order to be able to remain at home, in order to be able to get better. For clarity, those who have been in contact with someone who has had COVID, they're still able to access education, be able to come in to school, but if they've had that contact, test and trace would then be in touch with that individual and advise them to take a PCR test. But that individual is able to continue to attend school during that time, unless, of course, they're demonstrating symptoms of COVID, where we would always advise people to self-isolate if that was the case, or, of course, they had had a positive PCR test. But other than those reasons, they were able to attend school.
Clive Effort.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State for Health has told us that there will be a spike in infections following the relaxing of restrictions. And there are 150,000 school pupils currently with suspected COVID that are out of school. So we know that that figure is going to go up. So this isn't about children dying of the infection. It's about schools being a vector for infection. And what is the Secretary of State going to do when the winter months are coming? We have increasing numbers of infections. to ensure that that doesn't happen by improving ventilation and assisting schools with the resources that they need in order to deliver a safer environment.
Well, I don't wish to sort of contradict the honourable gentleman, Madam Deputy Speaker, but, schools haven't been vectors of transmission. They have been reflective of the wider rates of COVID in the community, and they've been sort of reflective of that. And so we continue to, this is why we continue to have measures in place, including the testing that will be in place for schools as they return after the sort of summer period, and the continued twice-weekly testing that will run through September for children of secondary age to be taking those tests at home.
We now go by video link, or rather audio link, to Mark Harper. We don't.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. When schools return in
We will try to.
When schools return in September, every adult will have had the chance to be.
No, we will try to come back to the Right Honourable Member as soon as we can. Meanwhile, Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If you look at the data in York, infection rates are soaring, particularly in school-aged children. People are poorly, and as a result of that, we're seeing major disruption in young people's education. So as we see infection rates soar across the country, it means education will be further disrupted, and I hope the Secretary of State recognises that. So how will he ensure there is effective testing put in place, working with our public health teams on the ground locally to mitigate against this spike in infections and ensure that young people are supported and families are supported as they're having to isolate and also miss school?
Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is absolutely right that schools have and should continue to have a close and strong working relationships with local public health teams, not just in York, but right across the country. We have emphasised that as part of our guidance that we have issued and made available to schools, because we can recognise that we still have more to do, and the work in terms of defeating this virus will continue for past the summer and into the winter.
And now we go by video link to Nigel Mills.
Thank you. Can I welcome today's announcements? Could the Secretary of State confirm that the easing in restrictions won't affect his plans to provide high quality tutoring alongside normal education in schools?
I can absolutely reassure my honourable friend that that will be the case. I mean, their high-quality tutoring and the rollout of a national tutoring programme to have a positive impact on so many is one of the absolute top priorities of this government. It's the single thing that can probably have the biggest impact in terms of helping children to catch up on the lost learning. That's why we're making such a substantial investment into it.
And now we go by video link to Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What is the government doing to prevent the chaos of last year by ensuring that all higher education students can receive both vaccinations before moving around the country to their university? And how will the Secretary of State ensure that those turning 18 late in this academic year are offered both vaccinations before they move to university?
The Honourable Lady raises an important point, and this is why we're so pleased that we've been able to say to all those who are 18 and above that they have access to a vaccination, and we are working very closely with the university sector to really get through that message about how important it is that youngsters, students are out there getting their vaccine. It not only protects themselves, but it also protects their friends, their families and their community.
Richard Graham.
Madam Deputy Speaker, having called for this in last week's debate, I warmly welcome the Education Secretary's statement today to prick the school bubbles and self-isolation system with effect from July the 19th. But could my right honourable friend just confirm the timing and whether it's entirely up to the schools themselves whether they implement any or all of these measures in the last week of term? What will happen during the summer schools, and how does the timing of this combine with his statement that children only need self-isolate if they test positive after August the 16th?
So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Member for Gloucester asks and then it's delivered for him. So it goes to show the power of the Honourable Member. We're leaving it to the discretion of schools for the final few days of terms. We're not expecting bubble systems to be operating during summer schools, including the holiday activity and food programme. This will be purely a test and trace approach, as they currently do with the whole adult population. And as we move to the 16th of August, this will be the moment that we're able to move to the system of not having to self-isolate for children, as they will able to just go for a PCR test and get that confirmation that they don't have COVID, or if they do have COVID, then sadly they will be in a position, and understandably, where they would have to isolate.
Andrew Gwynn. Thank you. School children have had a pretty miserable year, and COVID is a pretty miserable disease that tackles, that doesn't recognise the inequalities in society and disproportionately affects some of the poorest, most disadvantaged communities, the same communities that often need extra resource and help to get that educational attainment. So what more is the Secretary of State doing to tackle this inequality that was there before COVID but will still be there after it and exacerbated by it, to ensure that those children have the best start in life? They're our country's future. What more can we do to help them catch up and excel?
Well, the Honourable Member for Denton and Reddish and myself share that same passion to deliver that sort of change and deliver that sort of opportunity for so many children. It should never matter where you grew up. It should never matter as to what your personal circumstances. The ability for every child in this country to be able to access the world's best education, the very best opportunities, is something that I think drives us on all sides of this House. And there is, you know, we've talked about the investment that we're making in terms of supporting children, to be helping them to be able to catch up. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the drive in terms of raising standards in education, making sure that there is that knowledge-rich curriculum, that we're pushing every child, no matter their background, to their absolute maximum in order for them to be able to excel and have the opportunities that every single one of us would want for our own children, we want for the nation's children, and that is where the focus will be. And we are looking forward, as we cast our eyes further to the year ahead, as to spelling out a sort of a longer plan as to where we are going to deliver this in education, ensuring that we deliver for not only his constituents but all our constituents, regardless of their background.
Felicity Buck.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statement today. I understand that testing will continue in secondary schools until the end of September, and at that point it will be reviewed. Can my right honourable friend update the House as to what criteria we will be looking at the end of September? Because I don't think any of us want to see testing in schools in perpetuity.
None of us wish to see testing in perpetuity in schools. We are, though, as the Prime Minister has at every stage set out, taking a cautious, gradual approach to ensure that as we are able to lift restrictions, we're not in a position of having to reimpose them. So we feel that this is a prudent and sensible step that needs to be taken. If there are concerns and there is a continued need in order to be able to have testing in schools, then we would of course look at doing this, because the most important thing I think for all of us is to ensure that schools remain open and pupils are in those schools.
Tim Farron.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was at the Bendrig Trust Outdoor Education Centre in my constituency. It was a massive joy to be able to see residentials beginning to slowly start again and young people getting the benefits from outdoor education. But it's a reminder of two things. Thing one, 6,000 to 15,000 people working in outdoor education at the beginning of the pandemic have now lost their jobs. And because of the lack of a specific bespoke package to support those centres, there are many that have closed and many more that are on the cusp of doing so. But the other thing that it reminds us of is that our outdoor education specialists in Cumbria and around the country have a unique set of skills that we need to deploy at this very moment to encourage young people to re-engage with learning and reignite a love of learning. What will he do to specifically commission outdoor education centres to do that out in mainstream schools? And will he meet with me and some outdoor education specialists to make sure we can explain how it could be done?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's like as if his constituency neighbour, the honourable member for Barrow, and him sort of think incredibly alike. I'm sure not on absolutely everything, but certainly on this issue. And the honourable member for Barrow and Furness was meeting with myself just last week, and we're talking about this exact issue. Of course, the best thing that we can do in terms of helping those outdoor centres is making sure that their doors could open, not just to be able to welcome day visitors, but those who want to stay there on a residential basis. And we'll continue to look at what other measures we can do to support this sector. I know that the value and enrichment that comes as a result of doing so many activities, whether it's beyond Lake Windermere or so many other excellent locations around the country, bring real benefit. And I'm sure that my right honourable friend, the Minister for School Standards, would be happy to meet with him and some colleagues.
Jonathan Gullis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I strongly welcome my right honourable friend's statement and the 4 schools in Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Talk, that received condition improvement funding, such as Golden Hill Primary Academy. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, rather than flogging the dead horse of exams, which I was going to do, I'm going to jump to a different one instead, which is let's lock off 10% of pupil premium funding. Let's make sure that funding goes into high-quality extracurricular enrichment activities, as laid out by myself previously in the House and with the Challenger Trust, who do excellent work up in Gateshead. And let's ensure that we can give those disadvantaged pupils the access to high-quality enrichment activities that many enjoy, such as the type of schools that I attended, which were private schools such as Prince Thorpe College.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable member for Stoke-on-Trent North and Torque and Kidsgrove is a man that does like to chew a Secretary of State's ear off, especially when it comes to condition improvement funding for his schools. And it was great to see that 4 schools benefiting from his assiduous lobbying on this matter and making sure that he's delivering for his constituency. The honourable gentleman raises an important point about the use of pupil premium funding, and we do want to see schools looking at how this is more effectively targeted, especially at those pupils who are from the most disadvantaged background, especially at those pupils who need that extra support. And in the past, far too often, it's been just seen as another stream of funding going into schools, and I think we do need to get schools to be looking at how this is delivering for those pupils that it was targeted at.
And we now go by video link to Tahir Ali.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can the Secretary of State explain how children will access free school meals if they have to isolate away from holiday activities and food programmes during this summer? And does he agree with me that a cash transfer system enabling parents to get the fund and supplies that are right for the children would actually ensure better support reaches all those that need it?
The honourable gentleman raises a valuable point, and this is why the support provided by the Department for Work and Pensions through local authorities being able to provide free school extra assistance in order to be able to ensure children are fed through the summer is such an important part of our programme, sitting alongside our holiday activity and food programme, which of course is going to be delivering not just food for so many students, but also activities, which is just as valuable.
In the hope that communications have improved in the Forest of Dean, yes, we'll try to go back to Mark Harper.
I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. When schools return into September, every adult will have had the chance to be vaccinated once at least, which provides the bulk of protection. So why is regular testing still going to continue, perhaps forever? Last week, the Secretary of State said he wanted to see it end. What's changed?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, not only do we get his voice, we get his picture as well, so enhanced in every single and possible way. Of course, we want to see schools returning to as much as normal as quickly as possible, but we have always taken the view that we need to take a cautious and careful approach, because we always want to see things being in a place where we're not having to take steps backwards. We had one of the most successful testing programmes that have ever been run in this country that was delivered in schools on the week commencing for March the 8th, and we have seen this play an important role in terms of containing COVID and dealing with COVID, but most importantly ensuring that we can keep schools open and welcoming to pupils.
Tom Hunt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whilst all these huge issues are going on, the largest teaching union in the country, the National Education Union, has said there is an urgent need to decolonise the curriculum, and how classroom layouts are in fact represent colonialism. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that actually probably more of an urgent need is for the largest teaching union in the country to finally focus on this urgent need to get kids catching up their learning, and to work, perhaps for the first time, constructively with government to try and ease these remaining restrictions?
Falstead resign. My honourable member is a new member and arrives here with a lot of optimism, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to reassure my honourable friend that we have a broad and balanced and knowledge-rich curriculum that we should be very proud of, though we always work to make sure it's even better. But it is with some sadness, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's the National Education Union, first of all, started off by saying that they didn't want teachers to teach pupils in person. Then they said they didn't actually want teachers to teach students online. It starts to make you question as to whether the National Education Union really actually believes in education at all. But we will wait and see, and hopefully there'll be more cooperative and hard-working in the next academic year.
So now we go by video link to Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Regular testing for pupils and staff is going to be a vital part of stopping the spread of COVID-19. But the decline in testing numbers shows that home testing currently isn't working well. Tackling this with on-site testing would mean some schools in my constituency having to test 600 children a day, which they tell me they simply don't have the resources to do. Will the Secretary of State give schools the resources they need, including external support if they need it, to make sure they're able to carry out testing and keep children safe?
I would like to reassure the Honourable Lady that we will be supporting schools as they roll out the testing. Schools have delivered the asymptomatic testing on school premises incredibly successfully already in this academic year, and we'll look at providing the same level of support to schools as we did earlier on in March, and we have every confidence that we're able to deliver that right across the country.
James Wild.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome these changes that will mean that healthy pupils can spend more time in the classroom. And following my recent visit to Ashwickham Primary School, can I urge my right honourable friend to ensure, as part of the recovery plan and with an eye to the spending review, that schools get the special educational needs funding that is required now more than ever, so that every child's needs are met.
Well, I know that my right honourable friend is a great champion for not only his schools and his constituency, but also children with special educational needs, where we all have a very shared passion to do more for. He's tempting me into sort of public discussions with Her Majesty's Treasury, maybe a sort of over the dispatch box straight to the Chancellor. While I'm tempted and he's desperately trying to lure me down that path, I'm going to decline on this occasion to sort of enter that public discourse. But of course, children with special educational needs are a top priority for us. I would certainly be expecting that is properly reflected in any future settlements.
Chiomura.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the end of mandatory bubble isolation, which has caused such disruption to parents, teachers and children. But the impact of COVID continues and the poorest are hardest hit. Over the last 5 years, child poverty in Newcastle Central has risen by 13 percentage points to 45%, 6 times the national average increase. So what additional support can children in Newcastle Central expect, apart from the catch-up plan, which the government's own Educational Recovery Commissioner described as feeble?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, one of the things that we can do to best help all children across the country is the continued drive to raise standards across our schools. Of course, she sort of dismisses a over £3 billion investment that we've made. But this is an important investment targeted at the interventions that will deliver the biggest benefit to her constituents.
Steve Bryan.
Thanks. Last Monday I made clear my view and those of many in my constituency, the unfairness of the bubble system and the consequential isolation, so I welcome today's confirmation. But isn't it the case that sending the whole bubble home because of one positive case is no more necessary now than outdoor sports days being cancelled or held behind closed doors, or end-of-term events being ruined, things that we never get back? How can the Secretary of State and his team help colleagues across all educational settings feel supported to get the balance right come the new term?
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend picks upon the issue of sports days, and let's be absolutely clear, the guidance is absolutely there in black and white, saying sports days can proceed. Parents should be able to attend, and we really encourage schools to be able to do that, because he rightly points out these are things that you can't get back. So this is why we wanted to be able to lift those restrictions at the very earliest possible moment. If members, and I know my honourable friend is familiar with his regional schools commissioner, if there are challenges, having that local dialogue with regional school commissioner teams are an important part if they are having challenges in terms of dealing with their school directly.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Early years and nurseries, like the fantastic Grasmere Nursery in Luton North that I had the pleasure of visiting recently, are a vital part of our education system. While primary and secondary schools have had some of their COVID costs compensated, nurseries have not had a single penny of costs incurred during the pandemic reimbursed. Why are nurseries always an afterthought for this government? And will this unfairness be rectified? And if not, why not?
I'm sure the Grasmere Nursery is reflective of many nurseries right around the country that actually had the sort of benefit of being funded at pre-COVID levels, and we carried on that level of funding, recognising the fact that they were operating in truly exceptional times.
So no then.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statement and the step back to normality and letting children be children that the scrapping of the bubble system brings, but there continues to be an anxiety that affects people on both sides of this particular debate, and that is whether the vaccination programme will be extended into those under 18 years of age. So can I ask my right honourable friend to redouble his efforts to work with colleagues in the Department for Health and Social Care so that we can push the JCVI to come forward with their recommendations, so one way or the other a decision can be made that takes away that additional anxiety from young people?
My honourable friend is right to highlight the important nature to ensure that we have the correct and best information to inform decisions on the matter of vaccination of children. It is my hope that JCVI will be forthcoming imminently with their report, and that will obviously that will obviously inform decisions that government makes very much in the best interest of all our children.
And finally, Liz Twist.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. For many months now, school leaders have been spending a lot of their time on weekends making contacts where they're notified of someone having COVID-19. So I'm glad to say that some of that responsibility will be shifted to NHS Test and Trace. But can the Secretary of State just clarify exactly what that relationship will be, given the references to settings still having a role to play in that situation?
Secretary of State. Of course, and the Honourable lady is right to highlight the amazing and important role that schools, head teachers, the whole education team have played in terms of supporting the efforts on Test and Trace. We expect the contacting to shift from schools having to do it to shifting to Test and Trace to do it. But of course there will still be contact and information that will sometimes be asked of schools. But we don't imagine that the current burdens that schools have to face will be, we see this being scaled back considerably, very much to head teachers and teachers' benefit.
Thank you.
Point of order.
Point of order. Mark Tammy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On Friday, the Secretary of State for International Trade visited Airbus at Broughton in my seat. Her office gave me 14 minutes notice before the meeting was due to take place. 14 minutes, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just wonder what she can advise we can do to ensure that the rules that apply to the rest of us also apply to government ministers.
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for having given me notice that he intended to raise this point of order, and I can say very simply and in a straightforward way that such behaviour by a minister, or indeed any member, is wrong. Just quite simply wrong. Members may not be aware because things have not been operating normally here this last year and a bit. There is a little booklet called Rules of Behaviour and Courtesies in the House of Commons. I seriously advise everybody to look at this little booklet. It's not some ancient tome hidden away in the library about the way in which things work here in this ancient parliament. It's bang up to date. And it says quite clearly, on a matter of courtesy between one member and another, that you should notify colleagues whenever you intend to visit a colleague's constituency, except, of course, on purely private visits. And I take it that the Honourable Gentleman is certain that this was not a private visit. I take it that the Honourable Gentleman has informed the Right Honourable Lady to whom he refers. I have. Excellent, that he intended to raise this point of order, then she will be aware of the situation. And I can simply say to all members that it says in this booklet, and Mr. Speaker takes this very seriously, failing to inform colleagues of your intention to visit their constituency is regarded as very discourteous. And that's what I can say to the Honourable Gentleman now. It is discourteous for a minister to behave in this fashion. I'm quite sure that an apology will be forthcoming. Point of order, Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, the government rejected the cross-party proposals from the Business Select Committee into the Mine Workers Pension Scheme. Can I ask through you, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether the government will come to this chamber and give a statement and explain their disgraceful decision to continue to take billions of pounds from the pockets of retired miners?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her point of order and for having told me she intended to raise this point of order. I'm not at all surprised, as I've heard her speak many, many times about this subject with passion here in this chamber. The Honourable Lady will know, of course, that the decision of ministers to whether or not to come to the House to make an announcement or to respond to a report is not a matter for the Chair, but I can advise the Honourable Lady that there are various ways in which the Table Office will be able to advise her that she might endeavour to bring a minister here to the Chamber to answer the questions which clearly to her and to her constituents are important questions. Thank you. I will now suspend the House for 3 minutes in order that arrangements can be made for the next item of business. Order! Order! Presentation of Bill, Secretary Sajid Javid.
Health and Care Bill.
Second reading, what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Presentation of Bill, Secretary Priti Patel.
Nationality and Borders Bill.
Second reading, what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Thank you. We now come to the 10-minute rule bill. Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move
that leave be given to bring in a bill to establish an independent public inquiry into the government's response to concerns about fire and building safety. This bill would not duplicate or undermine the ongoing and essential work of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, nor would it repeat any of the Hackett review into building and fire safety regulation. What this bill does seek to do, however, is to compel the government to establish an independent inquiry into its handling of the fire safety crisis. It is now more than 4 years since the horrific loss of life at Grenfell Tower, yet this government's handling of the fire safety crisis has itself now become a national scandal of epic proportions. Tens of thousands of innocent people deserve to understand how and why, after 4 years, they are still trapped in homes that are not safe and which they cannot sell. They deserve to know why they are facing bankruptcy from bills they cannot afford with their mental health left in tatters. And they deserve to know the government's real motivations, because for 4 years, fire safety victims have had to battle with the government again and again at every twist and turn to get help to solve a problem that is not of their making, and for which there is still no end in sight. There are scores of questions that the government must answer, but they relate to 3 broad areas. First, the government's failures to date. Second, the faulty design of the Building Safety Fund. And third, the gaping hole between the Prime Minister's promises and his government's actions. Let me start with the government's failures to date. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is incomprehensible that 4 years on from Grenfell, we still don't actually know the scale of the building safety scandal. That's because this government has no complete data on how many mid-rise buildings below 18 metres have been built with dangerous materials and fire safety defects. It was revealed more than a year ago that the government had been told by its own advisers that the most dangerous forms of ACM cladding and insulation are unsafe on buildings of any height. And yet, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government admitted it did not have the data on the number of buildings below 18 metres which have cladding systems, or what proportion of the buildings which do are likely to be clad in ACM. The government could have taken immediate action, but it failed to do so. An inquiry is needed to find out why. The second area of the inquiry would be to look at how the government has designed the Building Safety Fund, because on the face of it, it appears as though the Building Safety Fund has been deliberately designed by this government to exclude a huge amount of issues and a huge amount of people. Housing associations with non-ACM cladding are excluded. Properties below 18 metres are excluded. And non-cladding fire safety remediation works are also excluded. Anybody who really wanted to solve this crisis would not design a remediation fund that excluded all of this. The Secretary of State has ignored recommendations from the Housing Select Committee that social housing providers should have free and equal access to the fund. This is in the face of a national housing shortage, when social housing providers should be investing their funds in new affordable homes. On the 18-metre threshold, how did the government reach the conclusion that buildings below 18 metres should be treated differently and not be eligible for the Building Safety Fund? Because the Secretary of State himself has described height as a, quote, crude factor when determining risk, and we all saw the video of a top civil servant working on the cladding scandal admit that the crucial 18-metre rule had been picked simply because ministers didn't have time to come up with a better number. And yet the government is still using it. Why? There has been no explanation of why this arbitrary figure has been applied. And the perverse nature of this 18-metre rule is demonstrated perfectly by the decks in Liverpool. To the casual observer, it is a development of 6 identical blocks. 3 of these are just above 18 metres and might qualify for help from the government, but the other 3 are just short of 18 metres and left out in the cold. So why does the government persist in using this 18-metre threshold when it's clearly unfair and in some cases outright absurd? An inquiry is needed to look into this. And then there is the size of the Building Safety Fund. The Housing Select Committee estimates that the cost to remediate cladding will be in the region of £15 billion. So how did the Secretary of State arrive at the very precise initial figure of £1.6 billion and then his revised position of £5.1 billion? Fire safety experts have repeatedly said that this fund is a mere drop in the ocean. So why is the government refusing to budge? And why has the government excluded all other fire safety issues that aren't caused by cladding from the Building Safety Fund? Flammable balconies, missing fire breaks, defective fire doors, dangerous insulation. These are all issues that have been identified as critical safety failings. And like cladding, none of these are the fault of leaseholders, yet they are still not being addressed by the government schemes. And that's even before the huge cost of waking watchers, which are needed to make sure that people's homes don't go up in flames. And finally, the third area relates to the gaping hole between the Prime Minister's promises and his government's actions. Last autumn, the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign put forward a very simple 10-step plan. In essence, it called on the government to stump up all the cash to remediate fire safety problems, to get rid of all the problems by the end of 2022, and then to use its weight to recoup that money from those who are responsible. That plan would meet the government's own test of not letting the cost fall to the taxpayer or to innocent building safety victims. On the 3rd of February this year, leaseholders were given fresh hope that their nightmare was finally over, because the Prime Minister stood at that dispatch box and told this House, and I quote, "We are determined that no leaseholder should have to pay for the unaffordable costs of fixing fire safety defects that they did not cause and are no fault of their own." But that fresh hope turned to false hope, because the Prime Minister and his government spent 10 months fighting members of this House who tried to protect leaseholders from these costs when we tried to amend the fire safety bill, but the government fought tooth and nail to stop us. On Sunday, with much fanfare, the Secretary of State announced he was bringing forward measures in the Building Safety Bill which would give leaseholders 15 years to take action against those who are responsible. Fire safety victims have already said that most of them won't benefit from this, either because the 15-year limit has already expired or because the potential defendants no longer exist or are insolvent. For everyone else, they now have to add the prospect of years of litigation to their woes. But what's really disturbing is that the Secretary of State has announced this in the full knowledge, and I quote from a National Audit Office report, that the legal costs of taking action are likely to outweigh the costs for remediation works in a significant number of cases, and I quote, that enforcing cost recovery from the outset could impact the pace of remediation. So does this government really think that it is acceptable for leaseholders facing bankruptcy and mental ill health to have to start legal action against huge, powerful housing companies, builders and others, when they know that the legal bills could cost more than the remediation work itself and then delay that remediation? This is Alice in Wonderland stuff. And it's not just that the Prime Minister and his government are falling short on this promise. They're doing exactly the opposite of what they promised, because this government is actively legislating to effectively protect the guilty whilst letting innocent victims hang out to dry. A public inquiry is now needed to rigorously investigate why this government has comprehensively failed to put any serious system in place to protect innocent building safety victims or recoup the costs from developers, builders, suppliers and contractors. And what precisely is this government's relationship with these potential defendants, such that it is so determined, time and time again, to put the interests of big developers and others ahead of innocent tenants and leaseholders? Madam Deputy Speaker, this public inquiry is desperately needed because when we said never again, some of us actually meant it. Fire safety victims have faced 4 years of delays, obfuscation and broken promises. This has become a national scandal of epic proportions and we need an independent inquiry to tell us why.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Ed Davey, Tim Farron, Munira Wilson, Sarah Olney, Leila Moran, Vera Hobhouse, Sarah Green, Alistair Carmichael, Wendy Chamberlain, Christine Jardine, Jamie Stone and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Daisy Cooper.
Fire and Building Safety Public Inquiry Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 10th of September, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Friday the 10th of September. Thank you. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Bill, second reading.
Now.
I have to tell the House that Mr. Speaker has not selected the reasoned amendment. We therefore go directly, the Minister, to move the second reading, Mr. Michael Gove.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a real pleasure to move the second reading of this bill. This bill contains within it provisions to ensure that we supersede the Fixed Term Parliament Act with appropriate, democratic and timely reform in order to ensure that we restore to this place and to the people an opportunity to ensure that the government that governs in their name can command the confidence of this House and the confidence of the public. The legislation that we are bringing forward, I hope, will command support across this House because it was both a manifesto promise in the Conservative Party manifesto, but also in the Labour Party manifesto as well. And as well as both front benches being committed to this legislation, it's also the case that this legislation follows on from an excellent report by the PACAC Committee, chaired by my honourable friend. It also follows on from recommendations made by the Constitutional Committee in the other place, and it's also received extensive scrutiny and indeed support from a joint committee of both the Commons and the Lords. So with both front benches and 3 important committees all in favour of this legislation, we can see already that the arguments that have been lined up for it are powerful and command wide support. And I sincerely hope that nothing I say this afternoon undermines that consensus. Very good advice from the member for Rhondda. He, like me, believes that brevity is the soul of wit. But I'm more than happy to give way to the honourable lady and to the honourable gentleman. Yes.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman giving way. Could he give us a definition of democratic in the light that it's moving power from this chamber, democratically elected as to call general elections, to royal prerogative?
Well, it gives power to the people. And fundamentally, all of us sit here at the pleasure of and at the disposal of our electorates. And fundamentally, as we saw from the addled Parliament or the paralysed Parliament or whatever you want to call the Parliament of 2017 to 2019, we actually saw parliamentarians frustrating the will of the people, both in attempting to overturn Brexit and also in attempting to sustain and power a government which needed to seek confidence both from the electorate and for the maintenance of its programme. And so for that reason, what we're doing is restoring power to the people which had been taken away by the FTPA. Happy to give way.
So I'll try to answer what I was going to ask him in his reply to the earlier intervention. But considering that there's been 2 snap elections in the last 4 years, what problem is the government trying to solve?
Well, it is precisely because there have been at least 2 elections of the kind that the honourable gentleman draws attention to, that the Fixed Term Parliament Act has not done what it said on the tin. It has failed the Ron-Seal test. And for those who advocated the Fixed Term Parliaments Act in the first place, all sorts of argument were made in terms of the importance of the predictability of election timing. And of course, the bill palpably failed to achieve that in the way that it failed to achieve so much else. And what we are doing with this legislation is restoring a tried and tested method by which Prime Ministers can command the confidence not just of this House, but of the country. I'm more than happy to give way to the honourable gentleman, a distinguished member of the Joint Committee.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Would he agree with me that any legislation in this area must work with any parliamentary arithmetic? And that was the problem we saw in the previous Parliament, and that is what going back to the status quo ante before 2010 would achieve. Yeah.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. We had an approach towards the dissolution of parliaments and the calling of elections before the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which was robust, successful and effective, and ensured that our democracy worked as it should. And what we are doing is ensuring that those tried and tested procedures are restored, and in so doing, fulfilling not just our manifesto pledge, but also, and it's a pleasure to do so, fulfilling Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto pledge and making sure that democracy in that way is underpinned. Very happy to give way.
Will my right honourable friend not agree with me that probably the Fixed Term Parliament Act was the single worst piece of legislation the coalition government introduced? Fortunately, I didn't vote for it then, but I will certainly be voting for this repeal tonight.
Well, if we look back at the coalition years, I think others are better placed, given that I served in the government for 5 years, to decide which was the worst piece of legislation that it passed. But the one thing that I will say for the Fixed Term Parliament Act is that it was very much a child of its time. And the Fixed Term Parliament Act was introduced, and it did achieve one purpose. It was introduced at the request of our Liberal Democrat coalition partners in order to ensure that for the 5 years of that Parliament, neither party could collapse the government in a way which might secure for either the junior or the senior coalition partner perceived political advantage. So it did serve that purpose for those 5 years, and notwithstanding the points made by my honourable friend, I actually think there are a significant range of achievements that the coalition government can take pride in, but nevertheless, it was specifically a child of its time, and while it worked in that narrow sense in cementing the coalition and ensuring that it could achieve the policy gains which I believe were gained during those 5 years, nevertheless, its utility beyond those years in tougher circumstances, I think, has been tested to destruction. Very happy to give way.
The Government Minister, in on a secret, not of all of us supported everything that was in the Labour manifesto in the last general election. But isn't there a worrying issue here, which is precisely what he refers to as the child of its time, which is that if the government can always reconstitute the Constitution every time it can pass a law, we have a problem here, because the government is most likely always to do so in its own interests.
Well, I take very seriously the points that the right honourable gentleman makes, because there are few people who are deeper scholars of our constitution or parliamentary history than him. But I think there are two things that I would say. The first thing is that sometimes there are constitutional experiments or innovations, and it's understandable that they will have partisans who can see benefits from them. But then we can see in real time and in real circumstances whether or not those constitutional innovations are right and work, or whether or not it is appropriate for us to go back to the situation that prevailed before, which is actually proven over time in a variety of circumstances to be both more robust and more effective. The second thing, the second point he makes is that, of course, there's always a temptation for governments or for any administration in power to seek to look to the rules and to seek to derive advantage perhaps from changing them. But the critical thing here is that ultimately the decision on whether or not an election has been called and Parliament has been dissolved appropriately rests with the people. And if we look at historical examples, we can see examples, as is the case in the 1970s, when Edward Heath decided to go to the country to ask the question, who governs? He believed that in choosing the timing of the election, he was doing so to his party's advantage. But when he asked who governs, the country replied, well, not you, mate. And on that occasion, it was the case that a miscalculation on the part of the Prime Minister resulted in the electorate deciding that Edward Heath's administration should end and that Harold Wilson's should take over. Yes, of course.
But in which case, one could conceive of a situation in which the government was aware of something that the public wasn't aware of that was coming up. So, for instance, a report or a major security breach that had not yet been made public. Or, for instance, the government might choose to hold a general election before boundary changes because they thought that that might be to their disadvantage or to their advantage. Would it not make far more sense for the House simply to be able to vote at that moment?
Well, I think in both the cases that the honourable gentleman mentions, if it were the case that there were to have been jiggery pokery, if it were the case that the government were to be acting in a way that the electorate considered to be heedless or reckless, then electoral punishment would occur sooner or later. And I think that attempting to rig the rules in that way, as we've seen in the past, is something that the public are always alive to, always wise to, and always ready to punish. And he mentions, very happy to give way.
I'm grateful to the Chancellor for giving way. Surely the biggest difference, though, between the situation today and that facing Edward Heath in the 1970s is the amount and the nature and the regulation of the spending of money. Heath did not have a long period before a short period of expenses, and there were not those controls. Effectively, this bill will allow the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister alone to be the only person who knows when that long period starts and to pile the money in. That's what this is about, isn't it?
No, it's not what it's about. I'm sure that thinking about money spent in elections, one of the things that I would say is this is an issue in which Liberal Democrats and other parties have long had an interest. But more broadly, the point that I would make is that the choice of election timing should ultimately depend on the capacity of the Prime Minister to command the confidence of this House. And we saw, during the course of the 2017-2019 Parliament, the consequences of the Fixed Term Parliament Act in a way that worked against the interests of democracy explicitly. Let me just make a little bit of progress and then come back to the Right Honourable Gentleman. Because we saw then what happened when Parliament attempted to sustain a government in office, to deny a Prime Minister the dissolution that he requested, and yet at the same time would not allow that government to get its business through. So we had a paralysed Parliament. We also had a Schrödinger's government. It was simultaneously in power and not in power, in office but incapable of carrying forward its legislation. Now, we saw in the December 2019 general election the consequence of that. The party which argued that there needed to be a dissolution, there needed to be an election, and there needed to be a refreshed mandate, secured that refreshed mandate. And as a result, we saw our democracy working as it has so successfully in the past and as it deserves to again in the future. Very happy to give way.
If, as the Minister says, this is about the point at which the Prime Minister can command the confidence of the House, surely that is something which can only be determined by this House and not the Prime Minister. So the point made by the Honourable Member for the Rhondda is a good one.
Well, the point made by the Honourable Member for the Rhondda is always a good one, but on this occasion it is nearly always a good one. But on this occasion, it is wrong. Because ultimately, the decision about whether or not it is right to call an election and the decision on whether or not the Prime Minister and the administration should return to power rightly rests with the people. And we saw during the course of the 2017-2019 Parliament that when parliamentarians sought to frustrate the Prime Minister in seeking an election, that when that election eventually occurred, an appropriate decision was taken by the voters. And we also saw during the 2017-2019 Parliament the reputation of Parliament, much to my regret, diminished in the eyes of the public because of its failure both to deliver on the original Brexit vote and to allow government to carry on its business in making sure that we return to a situation where we don't have the Fixed Term Parliament Act. We're keeping faith with democracy. We're also keeping faith with the basis on which this government was elected and indeed on which the opposition argued for office. Now, yes, delighted to give way.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman giving way again. The reality is that government hold privileged information, and in the light of the economic challenge which is coming down the path, surely this bill before us today is simply a cut-and-run bill so the government can call an early general election before it has to deal with that crisis.
Exactly right.
I completely disagree. I think that the, if we're looking at the broad economic situation which we face and what may happen in the future, we have, I believe, a well-informed and judicious electorate that will make a judgment whenever an election is called about the fitness of this government to be returned to office, or indeed the readiness of the opposition or indeed any other party to assume office. As has been seen in the past, when governments have sought to cut and run, when they have sought to manipulate the electoral timetable to their advantage, they've been punished. It was the case not just in 1974 with Edward Heath, it was also the case in the early 1920s with Stanley Baldwin, when he sought to cut and run at that time, using the formidable advantage that he had, indeed the support of press barons and the wealthy. It was nevertheless the case that what we saw was the return of the very first Labour government under Ramsay MacDonald, supported for all too brief a period by the Liberals of that time. Oh, yes, please.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for allowing me to intervene. The case that he's making in historical terms is absolutely incontrovertible. The fact is that the legitimacy of previous elections has barely, if ever, been questioned, and as soon as we brought in this wretched legislation, we ended up in what he rightly described as a paralysed parliament. However, is he satisfied that Clause 3 is strong enough to ensure that the Parliament doesn't get paralysed in the future by political uses of the court to try and interfere with the process of dissolving Parliament? Professor Eakins, in particular, I believe, has certain suggestions that might make this provision a little stronger.
Well, I'm really good to my right honourable friend, and I do believe that Clause 3 is robust and fit for purpose, but it is also the case that Professor Eakins of the Judicial Power Project attached to the think tank Policy Exchange is a brilliant legal mind, and we will pay close attention to his arguments and to those of my right honourable friend and others in order to make sure that Clause 3 is robust enough. And reference to Clause 3, I think, means that it is appropriate for me to turn to the specific clauses in this short and focused bill. But before I do so, I just wanted to thank again the work of the Joint Committee under Lord McLaughlin and others who did such a service to this House and indeed to the other place in scrutinising the legislation. And when reviewing the original 2011 Act, the Joint Committee found that the 2011... I'll give way in just a second. That the 2011 Act did fulfil, as I mentioned earlier, its immediate political purpose of maintaining the coalition government for 5 years, but it did not succeed in enforcing a supermajority constraint on the calling of early general elections, given what happened in 2017 and 2019. A mere repeal of the Act, without any form of replacement, hence the need for the legislation today, would create uncertainty and what the committee called a constitutional lacuna. The government should allow sufficient time for Parliament to explore the full implications of any replacement legislation, and indeed the committee's own work and the work of other committees has been a service to that cause. This constitutional legislation should secure, forgive me, a wide degree of cross-party agreement, and that exists in the support that's been given from the opposition front bench and from others. Any replacement should be equally suitable for whatever the parliamentary arithmetic provided by the electorate, which I believe this legislation does. Any replacement should consider allowing the date of any early election to be stipulated in the motion triggering that election, which of course we will, and that any replacement of the 2011 Act should not contain supermajority provisions. And they also made the point that future administrations might consider that if they introduced fixed parliamentary terms, they should consider whether the political gridlock which characterised the 2017-2019 Parliament is a price worth paying for the perceived benefit of a fixed-term Parliament. I think all of those arguments were powerful. I'd like to thank the committee again for their work, and in particular, and I should have mentioned it earlier, forgive me, I'd also like to thank the Minister for the Constitution and Devolution for the fantastic work that she's done in preparing this legislation and engaging with committees. It's the first time that the Minister has been back on the front bench in this House since her recovery from cancer. She's shown remarkable fortitude, and I know that across this House we're all absolutely delighted that she's back in her place. And with that, I'm very happy to give way.
I'd certainly echo the comments of the Secretary of State in relation to his colleague. On the issue of confidence, of voter confidence in this House, the legislation as it currently stands means that if a voter confidence is lost by the government, there's 14 days to form a government, and if not, that leads to an election. What would be the position following the passing of this bill? Would a loss of a vote of no confidence in the government immediately trigger a general election?
In those circumstances, the Prime Minister could immediately and should immediately request a dissolution of Her Majesty, and an election would follow. An example, of course, one of the most powerful in our recent parliamentary history was the loss of a vote of confidence in 1979 by James Callaghan. which of course led to the general election that followed. And indeed, some might argue, and indeed it's a counterfactual, the truth of which we cannot know, that had James Callaghan sought to refresh his mandate in 1978, when he was in a stronger position politically, then he might well have been returned. And again, the perception on the part of the Labour Party at that time, although they'd lost the support of the Liberals just beforehand, the perception on the part of the Labour Party at that time that it was in their advantage to continue was, of course, undone by a decision of the electorate. Yes, of course.
Just on the point of what counts as a motion of no confidence, because historically, many different things have counted as motions of no confidence. For instance, losing an amendment to the Queen's speech, or the loyal address following the Queen's speech, or an amendment to the finance bill, or refusing to grant supply for a military intervention, or refusing to allow a military intervention. Does he still think that all of those things would count as a motion of no confidence?
The formal motion of no confidence, traditionally requested by the opposition and which has to be granted within a day, that is a classic example of confidence. But I think on the question of military intervention, I personally, but again it's for the House to take a view, I personally believe that that is a proper exercise of the prerogative power in certain circumstances, and I think that, again, it's for debate perhaps in other fora, that would not count in the way in which he mentions.
Would he give way?
Yes.
I thank the Chancellor for giving way. Does he not agree with me that in that situation it would be open to any member of this House to ask the Minister, the Prime Minister at the dispatch box, whether he or she considered this to be a matter of confidence, and then what followed from that would indeed bear that out?
Yes, right honourable friend, I should say, is exactly right. And if it were the case that any Prime Minister felt that the House's decision not to grant supply, or the House's decision to censure perhaps an individual minister, or the House's decision not to authorise support for military action might mean that it would be appropriate to request a dissolution at that point. There are, not for a little bit, because I just wanted to run briefly through the clauses in the bill. There are 6 clauses in one schedule. The first clause repeals the Fixed Term Parliament Act. The second revives the prerogative power and allows the Prime Minister to request a dissolution from the monarch. The third clause is specifically there in order to ensure that that decision cannot be reviewed in the courts. It's what might be called an ouster clause. It's there explicitly to say that proceedings in this House relating to the exercise of the prerogative should not be justiciable. And I think it's very important, following on from the points made by my right honourable friend, that the House understands, appreciates and supports the bill on that basis. It has been constitutional practice since 1688 and the Bill of Rights that it should not be the case that these matters should be reviewed in the courts. Let me say that judicial review is an important part of keeping governments honest, but there needs to be an absolute limit on what is considered justiciable, and it should not be the case that the courts can prevent the request for a dissolution on the part of a Prime Minister. If that decision is mistaken, then it is for the people to decide in a general election what is appropriate. And I was very pleased that in the reports of the Joint Committee that they confirmed that it would be appropriate for Parliament to affirm that. Very happy to give way.
What if the courts sought to test the ouster clause?
Well, I don't think they would necessarily. I think there are people who might seek to. But again, one of the things that we can all do in this Parliament, and one of the reasons why his question is so helpful, and indeed the Joint Committee's deliberations were so helpful, is if Parliament affirms that is the case, then it would be remarkable indeed for any court to attempt to do that. It would be constitutionally unprecedented, and it would be, to my mind, risking the understanding of the balance between Parliament, when its will is clearly expressed, and then the court's interpretation of the law. But I think that when we come to committee and to third reading, and indeed perhaps later in this debate, I hope that all members will affirm the importance of the non-justiciability of the exercise of these powers. Yes, very happy to give way.
One of the things that came out of the Joint Committee report was a very clear interpretation that actually the Prime Minister requests a dissolution rather than advises the monarch on a dissolution. And I'm pleased the government have accepted that advice in the committee. But in light of that, does not that make the ouster clause completely superfluous? Because the monarch acting in conjunction with Parliament is indeed non-justiciable already.
That is definitely my understanding of constitutional practice. But without getting into the details of it, there have been one or two recent decisions by the courts, which might be thought by some to have moved one or two goalposts on the constitutional playing field. Lest there be any doubt, the ouster clause is there to affirm it. It is a new pair of braces to join the sturdy constitutional belt to which my honourable friend refers. Clause 4 makes it clear that the maximum length of any parliament should be 5 years. Clause 5 contains some minor updates, taking account of the way in which the FTPA modernised our electoral law. And, of course, it contains the schedule attendant to the bill. And Clause 6 makes it clear that this bill covers the whole of our United Kingdom.
Can I just confirm, I think it's Clause 4, my right honourable friend just referred to, that a maximum 5-year term would mean that the latest we could have a general election in this Parliament would be January 2025.
I believe that is so, but I think I would defer to others for fixing the precise date, but I do believe that is so, yes. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In addition to, of course, what is in the bill, in this matter we have to discuss what is not in the bill, which are the conventions that we are seeking to restore and the dissolution principles that were published alongside the draft bill. As you will know, the draft committee considered conventions and the paramountcy of confidence and all those things quite extensively. What conclusions have the government made from reading our report about the nature of confidence and in which circumstances calling a general election would not be an appropriate thing for a Prime Minister to do?
Again, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and we've produced alongside the bill a brief statement of dissolution principles. He's absolutely right. Our broad understanding of dissolution principles derives from a letter, actually, that was written by Sir Alan Tommy Lascelles, pseudonymously to the, glad I was able to use that word in the House of Commons, to the Times in the 1950s. And he argued then that a dissolution should not be granted if the monarch thought that there was a viable alternative that could command a majority in the House of Commons, or indeed if it were a time of economic crisis or peril, which it would be inappropriate for a general election to be called. We think that it is very difficult, and my right honourable friend, the Minister for Constitution and Devolution, made this clear, I think, in evidence to the committee and others, to provide an exhaustive list of examples in which it would be inappropriate for a dissolution to be granted when requested. And I think one of the things that we would like to do in committee in this House is to have a proper consideration of those. I think it's important that our Constitution always remains flexible and agile. And I think that I could conceive of circumstances, for example, immediately after a defeat in an election when a Prime Minister is still perhaps clinging on, seeking to form a coalition or a confidence and supply arrangement, failing to do so, when they might seek an immediate other dissolution shortly afterwards. I can see circumstances such as that in which it wouldn't be appropriate for a dissolution to be granted. But as I say, this is a matter in which I think it would be helpful for everyone to take part in the debate to outline those circumstances which they think should guide the operation of these principles. Yes.
I thank the Chancellor for giving way. Is it not also the case that if there were a vote in the Commons that many considered to be a confidence vote, but actually the government refused to accept that, it would be open to the official opposition to table a confidence motion, which then there will be no doubt whatsoever?
Exactly so. And it's absolutely important, as my right honourable friend points out, that we stick to the principle that immediately upon receipt of a request from the opposition for a vote of no confidence, that such a debate is granted, and that the Prime Minister of the day, of course, would make their case. It was the case, following on, I should say, from the defeat of an earlier attempt by the member for Maidenhead to secure support for her withdrawal bill, that a motion of no confidence was put by the then leader of the Labour Party. That motion of no confidence was defeated, and then allowed the Prime Minister to consider other ways of fulfilling that mandate. Yes.
I'm very grateful, and I don't want to test everybody's patience, but the one time when that is not available to the opposition is immediately after a general election, before Parliament has got on to actually meeting. And it's the government, and only the government, that decides when the House meets, what it decides to debate. And I note that we still have no formal process in our system of knowing when, after a general election, the House will meet to transact substantive business other than elect a Speaker and have the swearing in.
It is an important point, but it is also an important point to recognise that no newly elected government can effectively govern without Parliament. It would be impossible without a vote of supply. It would be impossible without a Queen's speech in order to ensure that the basis on which it was elected and the effective governance of the country could continue. And I think it's important that we recognise that that is the principle that's prevailed beforehand. It's the principle that we should adopt now. I just wanted to briefly conclude, because I recognise that there are a number of honourable and right honourable members who wish to speak in this debate. And I return to the point that I made at the beginning. Those who brought forward the Fixed Term Parliament Act were motivated, I think, by two entirely reasonable motivations. The first was to ensure that the coalition government, the first coalition that we'd had since 1922, was able to proceed and govern in an effective way. And of course, it was against the backdrop of economic crisis. And as a member of that coalition, I don't resolve for a moment from the many decisions that were taken during those 5 years. And let me take this opportunity to thank the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Orkney and Shetland, and others who served in that coalition for putting the national interest first at that time. The second thing that, of course, the Fixed Term Parliament Act was designed to do was to make sure that our constitutional arrangements became more predictable. And while the FTPA succeeded in the unique circumstances of the coalition years, it emphatically has not made our constitutional arrangements more predictable, as what happened in 2017 and indeed between 2017 and 2019 reinforced. And indeed, the circumstances of the 2017-2019 Parliament reinforced in the public mind, and certainly that was reflected in the general election result of 2019, the need to move to a more flexible, more responsive, more agile, more familiar and more tried and tested set of constitutional arrangements. And it's for that reason that I commend this bill to the House. Thank you.
The question is that the bill be now read the second time. Shadow Minister Cat Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just want to begin by saying how lovely it is to see the Minister back on the front bench after a reasonable absence, and how well she's looking, and how much, without wishing the entire debate away, Madam Deputy Speaker, how much we're looking forward to her contribution at the end of our second reading this afternoon. This bill seeks to do two things, as the Minister has set out. It repeals the Fixed Term Parliament Act of 2011, and it also reinstates the status quo as it was before 2011 and before that act came into place. Effectively, it is turning back time. And it's on those 2 points that I will kind of focus my remarks. Now, I suspect there's going to be quite a lot of debate in the second reading about whether or not it's considered that the Fixed Term Parliament Act worked. The Minister set out quite clearly that he believes the Act did not work, but I think there's an equally valid argument that aspects of that Act did work, although, of course, it was not without its pitfalls and flaws. Of course, in the best example of that, the 2015 general election took place 5 years after the 2010 general election, so therefore it works in the sense of holding that coalition government to that timetable. But I'd argue you could also say that the 2017 election proves that the Act worked, because there were clauses within that Act for having an early election, and those were gone through in the 2017 election. The debate about whether or not this Act works in a moment probably centres around the 2017 to 2019 Parliament, about whether or not that worked. And I think that probably highlights the flaws in the Act. Indeed, the fact that the Act said that the Prime Minister could control the date of the election, I would argue, was actually arguably one of the most sticking points of the Act, because of course at that point the opposition felt that the Prime Minister might abuse this Act in order to leave the European Union with no deal, and therefore the Act was not without flaw. There's also the issues around confidence motions and the questions that that raises, and I think that's probably going to be explored in quite a lot of detail. Does the Minister wish me to give way?
For giving way, and I concede her point that the Act did work as far as holding the coalition together till 2015 was concerned, but it didn't work in 2017, and if it hadn't been for the fact that the Scottish Nationalists and the Liberal Democrats, for political reasons of their own, decided to allow the dissolution, that stasis could have gone on for months or years longer than it did, and the Parliament would have been paralysed endlessly till the end of the 5 years. That cannot be right, surely.
I will let other parties answer for their own actions, and I certainly don't seek to speak there. But I think it would be a misinterpretation to say that the Fixed Term Parliament Act of 2011 was purely for the purpose of holding the coalition together. I think that was a huge reason for support in certain parts of the then government, but actually it was an idea that had been battered around in politics long before. In fact, it had been, I believe, a matter for various private members' bills before the coalition government came into force. So it's certainly not an idea that was just thought up in order to hold the coalition together.
Thank you, Honourable Lady, for giving way. Look forward to sparring on another constitutional bill. Just to come back to the point the Honourable Lady made about trying to set the date of the last election. What the Honourable Lady may recall is that 24 hours before the one-line bill was passed, the Fixed Term Parliament Act failed again to cause the election, and that one-line bill was put through. And the irony of that was that it was a two-thirds vote of the House for this one-line bill, which undermines the Fixed Term Parliament Act because it shows it was just being used to play games.
It's a pleasure to see the Honourable Gentleman in his place, and indeed I do look forward to sparring with him again on constitutional matters. And I don't disagree with that. I'm certainly not stood here to mount a defence of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. I was perhaps outlining some ways in which I feel the Act did work, but I'm also highlighting there are huge flaws in the Act. Indeed, there's a reason why in the Labour Party manifesto of December 2019 we said we would repeal the Act, and the point that he raises around the Prime Minister being able to control the date of the election is a huge reason why the Act is indeed flawed. However, I'm arguing that the principles of having fixed terms in itself is not necessarily a bad principle and a very pro-democracy principle in which to begin. I give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Something occurs to me that while the benches opposite, the government benches, might see what they described as stasis for 2 years, perhaps the public expect of the politicians that rather than just fix into positions and refuse to compromise, they should debate and find a way ahead for the country, and that the way is not always to jump, and that it should not always be the government alone who decides what is best for the country. That is Parliament's role, surely.
I would say that it wouldn't be at all like the Liberal Democrats to dig into a position and hold it. But the truth of the matter is that, you know, that Parliament, I don't believe, hit the troubles that it hit because of necessarily just the Fixed Term Parliament Act. I think if the Fixed Term Parliament Act had not been in place, I think that there would still have been huge problems because, of course, the governing party could not command confidence within its own members and have its own majority for its flagship policy. And I believe that that was the sticking point for that Parliament, and I think that the Fixed Term Parliament Act has been used as quite an easy scapegoat to be blamed for all of the ills of that Parliament. Whilst, of course, it's not a perfect piece of legislation and I support it being repealed, I certainly can see that the principles of having fixed terms is not in itself necessarily a bad thing to have. Indeed, I believe that the then Prime Minister David Cameron said 10 years ago when the Act was passing that this was the biggest move of powers from the executive in several centuries, which raises the question, if today we are to repeal that Act and go back to that status quo, is today the biggest transfer of powers from the legislature to the executive if we are going to go straight back to the old way of doing things? Indeed, the Conservative Manifesto of 2015 celebrated the Fixed Term Parliament Act's success, stating, we also passed the Fixed Term Parliament Act, an unprecedented transfer of executive power, which raises the question, today, are we transferring power to the executive? And if so, is that something that this House really wishes to do or give way?
Well, lady, for giving way, because this is such a therapeutic exercise. It's 10 years of hurt. I'm like a dog with a bone. The problem with the Fixed Term Parliament Act in 2011 was it transferred responsibility for keeping the coalition together away from the leaders of each of the coalition parties to Parliament. It was never any of Parliament's business to keep that coalition going. It was the responsibility of David Cameron and Nick Clegg, and I feel so much better for having got that off my chest for the second time in a decade. Thank you.
Wow, Madam Deputy Speaker, if it doesn't work out as a politician, perhaps I've got a career as a therapist. I do find it quite remarkable, though, that the Treasury bench, of course, has ministers sat there today who filed through voting lobbies to vote for the Fixed Term Parliament Act 10 years ago, and, of course, today, presumably, will be voting in quite the opposite way. I will give way.
The Honourable Lady for giving way. She asks who the transfer of power is to, but as my right honourable friend said earlier, it's a transfer to the people, and I enjoyed her exchange with the Liberal member opposite just now, but the problem with that Parliament is that Parliament did not trust the people, and that is why we ended up where we did, and that is why we had to have the election we eventually did, and that's why we had the result we did. So if we will just trust the people, I think we will all be much better served.
Yeah. The member is right in saying this is about power and where power lies, and I think where we disagree and diverge is probably about the definition of where this power is moving to and from. The legislation that we have before us is transferring all the power into the hands of one individual, the Prime Minister. Where power lies currently in terms of how we call an election lies with all 650 members of this House who are elected by the people. I would argue that the power to the people is more keeping a Fixed Term Parliament Act, of course, which I disagree with the Act and I support its repeal, but I disagree with what the government has come forward with as the replacement for that. And now, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to make a little bit of progress as I'm conscious of time. I just want to say a few words about comparisons, because I think it's always important to look at this House and how we do things and compare it to perhaps other countries or parts of the UK. And it's about the principle of who has the power to decide when an election is or whether or not that should be fixed. I believe, and the opposition believes, that the democratic position to take is the starting principle that these things should be fixed. Indeed, this is what's already the case for our Scottish Parliament, the Senedd Cymru, and Northern Ireland parliaments, as well as, of course, our local councils in England and English elected mayors. We know, and the people know, the voters know, when those institutions and individuals are up for re-election, when they can re-elect them to do their jobs or reject them if they disagree with them. The only question mark lies over this House and when this House goes to the people and goes to the country. So we are out of step even within our own United Kingdom. The most parliamentary democracies, dissolution is controlled by the legislature with varying degrees of involvement from the executive. Now, I'd argue this is good for democracy. The advantages are, of course, it's good for planning legislation and getting a government's manifesto through, which, of course, the people would have voted for if they were of the government. And it helps civil servants be able to work with politicians to plan that. It helps with our electoral administrators, who, quite frankly, have been put under an awful lot of pressure in recent years. It helps with us as political campaigners in terms of when does a long campaign spend start. When you know when elections fall, you know when spending limits can start kicking in. But it's also good, and most importantly, for voters to know when they can either re-elect or reject a politician. And actually, as the UK, we've got a strong tradition of parliamentary sovereignty, and I believe that Parliament should be central to any decision to dissolve. I will give way one last time to my friend.
Grateful for the Honourable Lady. And just to probe the point she's saying about when to have elections, is she saying there is a period of time where the opposition would not want to fight an election?
Well, I think that's the point, is that of course, an opposition will, under most circumstances, always want to have an election. And if he's referring to the 2019 situation, it wasn't not wanting to have an election, it was, of course, not wanting the situation to be that a government could take the country out with no deal of the European Union. That was the sticking point, and that was the issue with the day. I think that in most situations, an opposition would always want an election. Indeed, I could say quite confidently now that I think I do a downright better job than the member for Surrey Heath, but he knows that. And certainly, I'll give way to my own friend.
Might not there be a point where the opposition just wanted to form the government? Because the government had lost the confidence of the House, but the Prime Minister would want to have a general election because the numbers in the House might allow two different kinds of government.
I find it very difficult to disagree with my honourable friend, and indeed I think that the points that he's made, not just in that intervention but his early interventions on the Minister, have raised some important points that I hope that the House will consider, and I'm very grateful that this of course will be a committee of the whole House and we can have the advantage of my right honourable friend's insights and considerations at that stage, as well as his contribution to the joint committee there. There is no way that this legislation would be before us this afternoon if it didn't provide an electoral advantage. When governments decide when elections happen, there is absolutely no doubt it can be played to advantage. And as has already been made clear, the government can call an election before bad news is about to be delivered. They could call a general election if they felt that their opposition was in disarray. And Professor Petra Schleiter from Oxford University did a comparative study of 27 Western and European democracies and found that on average, when governing parties had a power to control when elections happened, they gained on average a 5% electoral advantage. Now, those of us who live and breathe this politics understand that that is the difference between potentially forming a government or falling out of government. So that is why it's so I'd argue anti-democratic to allow all the power to lie in the hands of one individual. And I will give way now.
Sorry to interrupt the Honourable Lady, but I mean that argument is somewhat of a straw house of an argument, because you could still use that at the end of a 5-year term of a parliament, whereby the government stacks the legislative programme to be so in the interest of its constituent base that it would win anyway. So I'm not entirely sure that that's an argument that holds water, because either way, the government of the day, whatever colour, is able to do whatever it wants in legislative terms that is most beneficial to its constituents.
And I suppose the difference there would be that when it was a 5-year parliament and all parties knew when that election was happening, then it is a level playing field. But when a government can call in a general election unexpectedly, the advantage is lying entirely with the governing party and not with any of the opposition parties. So the bill today therefore skews power towards the executive and towards incumbent governing parties. It also, of course, gives Prime Ministers the power to haggle with Parliament by threatening early dissolution and early elections. And I'd argue that the Fixed Term Parliament Act, whilst flawed and certainly support its repeal, it did put us more in line with other democracies which do constrain the power of Prime Ministers. Turning to the monarch and the attempt to restore a royal prerogative with legislation, if the Crown is left as the only check on untimely requests for dissolution, it does inevitably draw the Crown into controversy if such requests were refused. And I struggled to see the circumstances, and perhaps the Minister in her closing remarks might shed some light on this, by which a sovereign might decline a request for an election. I'd argue that the most effective way of avoiding such constitutional crisis would be to leave decisions on dissolution with Parliament, which is the right place, I'd argue, for a quintessentially political decision. As the Lord's Constitution Committee said when it was publishing its report on the Fixed Term Parliament Act in September, reform of the Fixed Term Parliament Act must keep the Queen out of politics, and I sincerely agree with that. The proposal that the monarch should be the only check on a questionable request for dissolution and the government's proposals inevitably risk dragging the monarch into politics. The easiest way out of this, I would argue, would be a parliamentary vote on dissolution, which would protect the monarch from being dragged into politics. It might just make a bit more progress, and I'm happy to give way. I would like to put on record my thanks to Dr Meg Russell and Professor Robert Hazel for their comments into the Joint Committee, which I've certainly found very useful, as well as their very informative podcast, of which, of course, my right honourable friend was a feature of. The arguments that I have heard around leaving dissolution in the hands of Parliament proves to me that this would be the easiest way to keep the courts out of these decisions. And I know that Clause 3 is going to be a topic of quite heated debates, and it is impossible to imagine the crack through which the courts could intervene if there had been a recorded decision of the House of Commons to trigger a statutory power of dissolution. If this approach was adopted by the government, I believe that we could see the need there we could remove this ouster clause, which in terms of how it is currently in the Act, I would argue would be self-defeating, because So long as prorogation continues as a prerogative power, one way to avoid Parliament being prorogued against its will would be to make the prerogative power exercisable at the request of Parliament rather than on the advice of the Prime Minister. An alternative would be to abolish the prerogative power and put prorogation on the same footing as the power of adjournment, enabling Parliament to be prorogued when the House of Commons passes a motion to that effect. Ultimately, though, I believe that dissolution should remain in the hands of Parliament and not the executive. This bill is very much about the question of where power lies. I believe that the Fixed Term Parliament Act was problematic, and there were certainly aspects of it that I would be quite happy to see the back of. But the principle of having fixed terms in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Indeed, it puts us on a level footing with many of the Western and progressive democracies around the world. It puts us in line with our own parliaments here in the United Kingdom, and prorogation should be in the hands of Parliament and not the executive. So as we move into the second reading debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd urge all colleagues to consider where power should lie and how checks on that power can be put in place. And indeed, if we are to place power in the hands of people, I would argue it's far stronger to have a situation where it lies in the hands of elected representatives of this House rather than the hands of one Prime Minister. Thank you.
William Wragg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I first of all welcome my honourable friend, the member for Norwich North, back to her rightful place on the Treasury bench, and just to say how appreciative I have been for her attendance at committee over recent months as well on this subject and indeed on others. And also thank my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, for the mention of our report on the subject, though perhaps it gave a slight difference of emphasis to that which came from the Joint Committee. But as he's in the gallery today, I pay full tribute to Lord McLaughlin from the other place for so ably chairing that distinguished committee. And indeed, there are many minds greater than mine in the House that have given this lots of thought on this subject certainly, if I can be self-deprecating. But as Badgett would have it, we are discussing and indeed now legislating for the at once solemn but also practical interaction between the dignified, as he put it, and the efficient. That is to say, the transaction between the monarch and the Prime Minister. And on that note, I was pleased to see that the draft dissolution principles were changed on the advice of the Joint Committee, such that the Prime Minister shan't advise the monarch of the need to dissolve Parliament, but rather to make a request so to do. Now, how have we reached this point? The disputatious nature of politics in recent years are too easily given as a reason, I might suggest, but the real reason I would contend is, at least partly, that the lesson of not tinkering with the Constitution to suit immediate circumstances. And that brings me on to the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Was it a high political ideal, as advanced by some, or a case of political expediency? I'd humbly suggest the latter. It was, of course, necessary for a smaller coalition partner to have the assurance that they weren't going to be cast off partway through a term when it might have been to the larger party's advantage to seek an election. And with all of this, motivation is key, and perhaps it's therefore helpful to briefly consider the dissolution principles, which have been mentioned already as the Lascelles principles. In May 1950, Senex being his pseudonym, Lascelles, the King's private secretary, wrote to the Times to suggest 3 instances at which no wise sovereign would refuse a dissolution. We've heard them already, but if an existing parliament was still viable, if there was a general election, would be detrimental to the national economy, and the third, and perhaps most interesting and still relevant one, that the sovereign could find another prime minister who could carry on government for a reasonable period with a working majority in the Commons. Do they all stand today? I think, as I've said, the latter one certainly does. Now, most people's knowledge of Tommy Lascelles, I'm afraid, comes from the Crown series. That's how we learn history these days, and of course it's a flawless representation of the truth. And they know that rather than his letter to the Times some 70-odd years ago. And here I seek to make a tangential link to the world of drama for all our players in our unwritten constitution. Each has a role set for them even if it is unscripted. The actors must conform to the expectations if we are to avoid the play that goes wrong, or indeed the parliament that goes wrong. And in recent history, I'm afraid that at times some have gone off the unscripted script, if such a thing were possible. Because, of course, politics is a numbers game, and the reason why we had such a quagmire in the last parliament was that the numbers didn't quite add up. And this is not surprising given that the testing circumstances of the 2017 parliament. But it is also a reflection of the, if I can be charitable, the constitutional short-sightedness, and if not, vandalism, done by the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005. Add to this the novel action of the prorogation, if I can put it that way, the prorogation that never was, combined with the actions of the former Speaker of this House. In short, everybody went off script. But fortunately, the ultimate safety valve of our Constitution, a general election, worked. Now, I support this bill, but I do question, in my view, of course, all in my view, the member for Rhondda from a certain position, in the people's view. He'll have, the House will have a chance to listen to his utterances later on, and we look forward to it immensely. But I do fear, he will teach us a thing or two, but I do fear that clause 3, the so-called ouster clause of this bill, may be superfluous. Its inclusion could be seen by those of a cynical bent as being a hangover from the intervention of the Supreme Court in 2019. We should hold more surely to the Bill of Rights of 1689.
Yeah.
After all, the Queen in Parliament is not justiciable. At least that's my understanding.
The SNP spokesperson, Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.